Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled The Political Ethics of Bilingual Education. I'm Patrick Donovan, Research Associate and Advisor at Questron, an affiliate professor, Department of History at Concordia University, and I will be moderating this Lunch and Learn. The presentation will be in English with subtitles available in French. Alors, si vous voulez des sous-titres en français, veuillez choisir le bouton sous-titres en bas à droite de votre écran et puis cliquez sur afficher les sous-titres et ensuite cliquez sur l'onglet traduction et changer la langue de sous-titrage vers le français s'il y a lieu. A few technical reminders. Please remember to keep your microphones muted during the event. Make sure they're muted now. If you have any technical difficulties, you can write a message in the chat and we will address the issue as best as we can. Reminder, we're recording the session today. It will be shared on our YouTube page. And please write any questions you may have in the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will be prioritizing questions that are written before going into verbal questions. Before continuing, I would like to acknowledge that Concordia University recognizes the Ghanaian Gahega Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters it resides on. Jojake, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We continue to reflect on the ways in which we can work in collaboration with Indigenous communities to form mutual and ongoing relationships. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise du gouvernement du Québec. Questron also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. Please note, this is a space for intellectual exchange, and any views or opinion expressed in this talk do not necessarily represent those of Questron or its funders. I now pass you over to Mr. William Flock, Assistant Deputy Minister at the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, who will say a few words.
Okay, bon, ça marche maintenant? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, okay. Merci, Patrick, thank you. As usual, it's a great pleasure to be with you and to have the opportunity to both participate and learn from these lunch and learns. I'm very much looking forward to Dr. Weinstock's presentation. It's obviously important to English-speaking Quebecers, but also to folks like myself, government players. Comme la plupart d'entre vous le savent, une des dimensions clés de mandat de notre secrétariat est de soutenir la recherche et de bâtir les relations entre les organismes et institutions des communautés d'expression anglaise et le gouvernement de Québec. Nous avons également des responsabilités à l'égard des autres ministères du gouvernement de Québec et d'autres paliers du gouvernement. Des événements comme les Lunch and Learn de QSCREN correspondent très bien à notre mission et offrent à nous tous une occasion d'engager et de nouer les relations avec des autres acteurs clés. La capacité de QSCREN à réunir des conférenciers intéressants et un public d'acteurs clés de monde universitaire ainsi que des secteurs communautaire et governmental est très apprecié. Among the 80 people that are registered for today's Lunch and Learn, we can note that there are representatives from both levels of government. Pour le Québec, on a nous, le secrétariat, mais le ministre de l'Éducation et le commissaire à la langue française. We're also appreciative of the participation of colleagues from the federal level, their Commissioner of Official Languages, Statistics Canada, and Canadian Heritage. I'm also pleased to see so many different players in the education system who are participating and joining this session. So we have people from universities, from CEGEPs, from school boards, and from independent schools. So it's very encouraging to know that the topics are of interest to folks from those sectors. And then finally, we have a good representation, cross-section of community organizations, both at the regional and national level. So like all of you, I'm looking forward not only to Dr. Weinstock's presentation, but also to the question period and discussion afterwards. So I'll pass it back to you, Patrick, and just wish you a good conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flock. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Daniel Weinstock holds the Katharine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy at McGill University, where he holds appointments in law, philosophy, the Max Bell School of Public Policy, and the School of Population and Global Health. He was recently inducted into the Order of Canada, and he gave an excellent and thought-provoking keynote address at our ACTFAST conference in 2014. So we're delighted to have him back. Over to you, Dr. Weinstock.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Comme l'a dit l'hôte de la séance, je vais parler en anglais, mais je serai très heureux de répondre aux questions et de discuter en français par la suite. I'm an old-fashioned lecturer. PowerPoint came along too late for me to really adopt it fully. And I actually made it all the way through the pandemic teaching online without using PowerPoint, which is, I think, quite a feat. And so today will be no exception. For those of you who are waiting for slides to come up, it's only me. But hopefully it'll be clear enough that people will be able to follow along. So let me say a little bit about the context in which this particular piece of research that I've been invited to talk about emerged. So a few years ago, the University of Chicago Press launched a series of books, of short books, in which they matched a historian and a philosopher to write about issues in education policy. So there's now about 8 or 9 books that have already been published that touch on a range of issues. There's some on teaching controversial topics in schools. I can't remember exactly the full list, but the book on bilingual education is in this series. And it was, as the name of the press indicates, commissioned by an American press that at the outset very much has American issues in mind. So in the United States, bilingual education is really, for the most part, almost exclusively about education in English and in Spanish, and about the the reaction of English speakers to initiatives that have really spanned the history of the United States to implement programs of bilingual education in places, obviously, where Spanish and English communities live side by side in sufficient numbers. So I thought, as a Canadian contributing to this, as the philosopher in a historian-philosopher pair, it would be important to think about other contexts, and in particular, the Canadian and Quebec contexts as well. And so that's really the context in which this research was born. My contribution was also published, my contribution to the book was also published as part of an already published volume called The Handbook of Philosophy of Education, published by Routledge a few months ago. So let me begin just by setting a little bit of context on philosophical context now on how it is that philosophers started becoming interested in issues of language justice. So it really isn't a very old preoccupation. It really begins about 10 or 12 years ago with a book that was written by a Belgian philosopher by the name of Philippe van Parijs, who spent his career at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, who wrote a book called Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World, in which he started off his reflection by saying, look, English has achieved a kind of status as a global lingua franca in a variety of very important domains. Obviously, in academia, it's very clear to those of us who now travel quite freely around the world, going to places from Latvia to China to Latin America, using English as a language that allows for communication across what would have earlier been almost insuperable language barriers, but also business, entertainment, the arts. English has really become the global lingua franca. And Van Parijs says that this is in very large measure a good thing. Speaking for myself as someone who has been in the academic world for 30 years, it clearly has opened up possibilities for exchange, for collaboration with people who at the beginning of my career, it would have been very difficult to collaborate with because of the language obstacle. And the openness to English has also grown, not just the capacity for people in different parts of the world to speak English, but the openness to do so. I remember the first conference that I was invited to in Paris at Sciences Po, where the organizer decided that it would be a good thing to have the event in English because he'd invited people from around the world. The event was actually boycotted by a good number of students and professors because they thought that this was a sign of linguistic imperialism of the United States or of English or what have you. And it was quite a political furore that was raised over this over this event. 25 years later, that is no longer the case. When I go to Sciences Po, it's more or less understood that I'll be lecturing in English because they have a lot of American students and others from around the world, and obviously English is the lingua franca. So what Van Parijs points out in his book is that while this is a good thing in large measure, it also poses issues of justice. And to see what those issues of justice are, consider why it is that we ascribe importance to language. And I think there are two sorts of ranges of considerations that lead to us ascribing such importance as we do to language. One is that linguistic is a tool, language is a tool. If we have English, we have a very powerful tool, which, as I've just mentioned, allows us to communicate, to open networks, collaborate, fall in love with people from just a great many parts of the world within our own society, and so there is an attraction that is felt by people around the world for this tool. English exercises a very great drawing power on people who want to be able to use this very powerful tool. Language is also a marker of identity, right? We value language because it is rooted in our histories. The particular linguistic repertoires that we have allow us to express things in ways that aren't quite the same from one language to another. As someone who has practiced his career in English and in French, it's clear that the languages work differently. They aren't exactly fungible. It's not the case that when I translate an article from English to French, there isn't some kind of a friction, creative friction between the two languages that makes it the case that when the article is translated or when I write in a different language, it comes out slightly differently and expresses slightly different thoughts. And that's a valuable thing to have that diversity. And it's something that means a lot to people. Now, if you're an English speaker, you get those two values, as it were, running together, right? You get to use the most powerful tool that we know of at the same time as you get to use a language that is a marker of your identity. So English speakers, native English speakers, don't, I think, experience the tension or they don't spontaneously experience the tension that comes from having these two values both present in the choices that we make about what languages to use. They both kind of come to them for free, as it were. The rest of the world isn't that lucky. The rest of the world, as it were, has to learn English and sometimes has to make tragic choices about moving over to English in contexts where they would perhaps rather, all things considered, remain true to their patrimonial languages. So there's really two kinds of justice issues that philosophers in the wake of Philippe Van Parijs's work have focused on. One has to do with the costs that come from having to learn this powerful lingua franca. English speakers don't have to deploy any extra costs in order to learn English. They get it, as it were, for free. Whereas the rest of us, I'm a native French speaker, the rest of us have to do something, expend resources, either time or money or both, in order to acquire the language that English speakers get, as it were, for free. And that poses a problem of what philosophers call distributive justice, right? There is an inequality in the way in which resources seem to be distributed by the distribution of languages. But there's also another dimension of justice, which has to do with the creation of cultural vulnerabilities for people who speak smaller, and I'm using the word smaller now in a purely numerical sense, for people who speak smaller languages. There's always a risk that too great a use of the lingua franca will start exercising pressure on the language of the language group, push the language out of a lot of areas of interaction. If you're using, I mean, it's something that I experience all the time when I go to Estonia or to Sweden or to Chile in order, for example, to examine a doctoral dissertation. It's absolutely clear that that doctoral dissertation will have been written in English, which means that academia is in places that speak languages that aren't the dominant language. Academia is becoming increasingly a sort of an Anglophone domain. So the problem is, how do you put bulwarks in the way of the lingua franca, the language that is shared by everybody, not becoming, as it were, the lingua sola, the only language that is being used. And a lot of language justice has to do not just with the distributive issues that I mentioned a moment ago, but with the question of to what degree is it just, is it fair to, as it were, put what are often obstacles and coercive legislation in place in order to arrest the sociolinguistic tendency that there is for the lingua franca, English, to become the lingua sola. And that's really where the question of bilingual education comes into play. So I start from the assumption in the article that in the book that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, that all things equal, bilingual education is probably good for children. There's all kinds of research that suggests that having, there used to be, I think, a sense amongst people who study these questions that having two or several mother tongues, languages that one considers fluent from a very early age, might be bad for children because of confusion that they might have, that the languages might sort of interfere with one another. I think the empirical literature is now, if not completely unanimous, fairly clear on the idea that multilingualism, all things equal, is a good thing for children, and that therefore, if that were the case, we ought, again, where numbers warrant, where the cultural and linguistic situation of societies warrant, to set up schemes of bilingual education. And by bilingual education, I mean something very specific. I don't mean, for example, Spanish schools where English is taught, or English schools where Spanish is taught, but rather schools in which ordinary elements of the curriculum are delivered in both languages. So it's not the case that you have a unilingual school with instruction, with language instruction, but rather all elements of the curriculum being divided up, as it were, between the two languages. And so the question that I ask myself, if we start from this assumption that bilingual education is good for children, are there contexts in which this going in presumption might be defeated for other considerations? And I distinguish between two different kinds of scenarios in which there's been resistance to bilingual education. One context is what I call nation building, and the other context is what I call asymmetrical bilingualism. When one looks at the history of the resistance to bilingual education in the United States, one sees very much something that is on the order of nation building. There is a sense, obviously there is some degree of just straight out racism, and that does underpin some of the arguments. But when you look at the more good faith arguments that are put forward by people who say, look, perhaps we shouldn't have bilingual education in the United States, they tend to emphasize the importance of a single language for the creation of a national identity. Right? The argument is, unless people all identify with the same language, we will have trouble doing a lot of things that we think nations should be able to do. There's a famous sociologist who's one of the sort of intellectual fathers of work on nationalism, Ernest Gellner, who said, look, one of the things that modern nations require is a mobile workforce. You need to be able to move workers around from one part of the country to another in order to engage in a national economy rather than regional economies. And to do that, you really need people to have a language that they can move around with that allows them to achieve that level of mobility. Other considerations that have been put forward by thinkers perhaps more on the left is that one of the things that nation states do in the modern world is they organize redistribution of resources from the better off in society to the less well-off in society. There's a suggestion that's made by some that it's much easier to motivate the better off to accept schemes of redistribution if they view themselves, as it were, as redistributing the resources towards people who are, quote unquote, like them. Benedict Anderson, another great theorist of nationalism, coined a phrase of imagined community, that nations are imagined communities. Of course, someone who is a well-off citizen of one part of Canada will have no direct encounter with people who they are paying taxes to support in another part of the country. But this idea of imagined community, of people who are, as it were, kin in some sense, is a powerful myth. It is a myth, but it's a powerful myth that has underpinned, that has motivated, according to this argument, the willingness of people to divest themselves of some of their resources, as it were, through schemes of taxation and redistribution in order to contribute to the well-being of all of their fellow citizens. And the concern is that if we have a multilingual society, a society in which people speak to one another in different languages, this might erode the motivational bases for redistribution. So I know I know that I'm running short of time, so in the book and in the article, this is an argument that I am quite critical of. This line of argument is an argument that I'm quite critical of. And I could go into more detail perhaps in the question period, but just to give you a very quick sense of the argument that I put forward to question the nation building argument, if indeed it is the case that people feel less willing, for example, to redistribute their resources to people who are less like them, I don't think that this is something that we want to, as it were, affirm through public policy. It's, as it were, the affirmation of what is a moral flaw rather than something positive. The lesser willingness that people might have to share with people who aren't like them is perhaps something that we want to undercut through schemes of redistribution rather than something that we want to affirm. And so in the book, I am quite critical of even the good faith arguments that use nation building of the kind that I've just described as an argument against bilingualism in general and against bilingual education in particular. Where I feel more sort of ambivalence and where I think there is something that might be said in favor of having legislation and policies that restrict bilingualism to some degree is in the context of what sociolinguists and philosophers have adopted this terminology, refer to as asymmetrical bilingualism. So asymmetrical bilingualism are situations very much like that which we have here in Quebec, but it's also true of places like Spain and with Catalonia or other parts of the world where you have a linguistic majority and a linguistic minority living side by side in very, very asymmetrical numbers. Belgium is an interesting case because the Flemish and French communities are roughly equivalent in terms of numbers. But in places like Canada, in places like Quebec, in places like Spain, and others that one could mention, what one finds is two communities putting aside other considerations of economic power, putting aside considerations of histories of conquest or other, just the mere numbers make it the case that the languages are not on a par, as it were, in their ability to draw members to themselves. Going back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, when I talked about the instrumental, the tool-like nature of language, a bigger language, be it a globally bigger language like English or regionally bigger languages like Spanish in the case of the Spain-Catalan relationship, allow people to access bigger networks with greater numbers of speakers, and therefore more opportunities for business, more opportunities for all kinds of collaboration. And so there is a going in kind of a priori tendency for these languages to be, in the literal sense of the word, more attractive. If you're an immigrant in a context in which there are no restrictions on what language you can educate your children in, what languages you can do business in, the lure of the numerically bigger language will tend to be greater. And a kind of, from the point of view of the smaller language, vicious cycle risks being put into motion, where every time an individual decides to make a choice, for example, in terms of the language that their children are educated in, for the numerically bigger language, it increases the attractiveness of the bigger language because, well, there's one more person who has made this already large network of linguistic interaction bigger. And so the only way to arrest this process is by putting in legislation such as what we've done in Quebec for 40 years now. I'm bad at math. More than 40 years, in order to, as it were, block that natural tendency that people have to make the choice that I've just described. And so we have things like mandatory education for immigrants and for francophones in French. We have signage legislation, all of the things that we all know about here in Quebec, of which there are equivalents in other parts of the world amongst linguistic communities that have jurisdiction over certain areas of education policy, of economic policy, and that have had to make such put in place such kinds of policies in order to protect their languages from the sociolinguistic dynamics that I described a moment ago. I think a very interesting situation that we find ourselves in Quebec right now, and I think it's echoed in other parts of the world that have enacted similar legislation, is that we are starting to question ourselves as to the appropriate metric or the appropriate indicator to put our finger on in order to identify whether the policies have worked or not. There's a sense in which, and I think that this is something here in Quebec that many of us, well, many Anglophones, many people, have put forward in order to, there's a sense in which the language legislation of the last 40 to 50 years have been hugely successful. Immigrant kids are now educated from grade 1 to cégep in French. They come out of the school system fluently Francophone. Anglophones are now the most bilingual community in Canada, speak French, perhaps not to a level of fluency in the majority, but to a level that is sufficient to interact with their French fellow citizens. And so the level of competency that we have today compared to what it was certainly when I was growing up in Montreal in the 60s and early 70s is incommensurable. We have made huge strides. And so there's a tendency to think, well, success, we've game over. We have achieved the goal that we wanted to achieve to stabilize what would have otherwise been this sort of very unstable situation because of the asymmetric federal bilingualism dynamics that I described a moment ago. I think one of the things that we have to at least consider as we move forward is whether we were looking, and this is the argument that is being put forward by a number of sociolinguists, demographers in Quebec, is that we're looking at least partially at the wrong thing. The problem is not one of knowledge, they'll say, but one of incentive. I can have perfect competence in a number of languages, and the incentive still be such that I am incentivized to use one language rather than another in contexts in which the use of one language isn't made mandatory by law. And so one of the concerns that people have is that though we have a level of competence in French that is sufficiently high, we don't necessarily have a set of incentives that ensure that French will be used commonly in contexts in which it isn't required by law. And there's an argument which I think is not completely to be rejected, balayer du revers de la main, as we say in French, that unless you have a situation in which people feel the incentive to use the vulnerable language in non-mandatory contexts, the language is still subject to a certain degree of vulnerability and fragility. So I get now to bilingual education. Philosophers often do this, right? We just talk about what we said we talk about after having set forth a huge amount of apparatus that allows us to get to our conclusion. What I suggest in the book and what I suggest in the article is that there may be an argument to be made for the fact that bilingual education would be a detriment rather than an aid to getting the right set of incentives. And this is for reasons which are a little bit subtle, and so I'll spend a moment going into them before I conclude and take questions. The goal of bilingual education programs, obviously, is to render people fully bilingual in both languages, the bilingual system, which sounds like a good thing from the point of view of the individual, but may be a bad thing in the context of asymmetrical bilingualism, where the risk is that if all members of society are equally fluent in both languages, you won't get the incentives lined up sufficiently for people to use the more vulnerable of the two languages. As it were, arresting, at least to some degree, the full fluency in one language will make it the case that it'll be more difficult or less attractive for the members of, for example, in Quebec, the linguistic majority, to just make the transition over to the bigger language, to engage in language transfer in large numbers. And this is something that might stabilize what would otherwise be a continuing asymmetrical bilingualism sort of dynamics, were it not for this sort of asymmetry in the ease with which people use both languages. So that's basically the argument. The argument is, to put it very briefly, we live in a very asymmetrical, in a context of deep asymmetrical bilingualism. If you compare French to English on the continental, at the Canadian level, at the continental level, at the global level, it is deeply asymmetrical. The sociolinguistic pressures that push people towards acquiring the larger languages are therefore extremely powerful. And the question is whether they can sufficiently be arrested simply by policies that increase the amount of competency that there is in the more vulnerable language, as opposed to change the incentive structure that people are under that lead them to using one language rather than another. And the question, and it really is something that I pose as a question rather than something to which I feel I have a determinate answer, because there are obviously other considerations that need to be raised in order to come to an all things considered evaluation of the policy of bilingual education in contexts like Quebec. The question that we might ask ourselves is, to what degree were we to contemplate a system of bilingual education in Quebec, would we be contributing to the sort of erosion of French on the basis of the sociolinguistic dynamics that I've just described, or not? And the suggestion is that there might be at least reason to consider that it would be something that would contribute to these sort of erosive forces rather than the contrary. So perhaps there's more in the paper, but I realize it's, I promised that I'd speak for about 20, 25 minutes. I've probably gone a little bit over that by now. And so maybe I'll just stop there in order to make sure that we have a lot of time for questions and discussion before 1 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weinstock. We're now going to move into the Q&A section of our event. I'll repeat that if you would like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be privileging questions. We're going to be prioritizing questions in that are written. So we already have a few questions, and I'll start with those. A question from Brian Rock: how dangerous is the present level of asymmetrical bilingualism in Quebec to the survival of the French language in Montreal, in the other regions? And I guess it relates to another question that was asked, that is, how should one measure whether a language is in danger or not? Like when is it actually asymmetrical and when is it not?
Well, I think the asymmetry is unquestionable, right? The asymmetry is just a numerical fact, which I think we can't, Quebec is not an island unto itself. It exists in the context of a country which is majority Anglophone, a continent which is massively majority Anglophone, and a world which, again, to go back to the Van Paris phrasing of the problem, that has taken up English as its lingua franca. So I think the question of the asymmetry is unquestionable. That's sort of a premise rather than a conclusion. The question is, at what point do we consider that a language is sufficiently under threat? Where under threat means no longer used as a medium of everyday exchange, I'm going to move over. I'm going to do a very sort of philosopher's thing and move the question over a little bit and ask a slightly different question, which is, if we recognize the sociolinguistic pressures, is there reason to enact legislation that or measures in the education in the area of education or elsewhere we don't wait until the risk is, as it were, too great to counter by policy, but as it were, adopt something of a precautionary approach in order to make sure that we are we never sort of face this situation. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. But again, I think that that's the right question to be asking in the context of what are like undeniable asymmetries in the sort of attractive power of English and of French. What are the right indicators to be looking at in order to state that we are facing a situation of risk, and how far, given those indicators, should we wait until we decide that we need to take measures that are preventive, as it were? So it could very well be that the measures that we have taken are already sufficient. The fact that we've achieved, high levels of competency in French amongst immigrants and amongst the Anglophone community may be a sufficient guardrail against the dangers that many language hawks are warning us against. But I think we have to take seriously the idea that competency doesn't get you incentives to use, right? Competency doesn't automatically get you what I think some people think is required in order to achieve a sort of stable situation with respect to the situation of French in Quebec. And again, we could look at situations around the world, Welsh, Catalan. Is it enough that is it enough, as it were, that you just have sort of coercive legislation that requires the use of French in certain kinds of contexts without the incentive structure that will lead people to do it to a greater degree voluntarily in non-coercive contexts? So that's my slightly evasive answer to the question, but it's all that I feel comfortable being able to say right now, that we have to consider the question seriously rather than my having a determinate answer to it. I'm not an empirical researcher, and so the empirical research on these questions I think has to continue, but has to continue whilst being clear on the distinction between these two empirical indicators that I mentioned.
On va passer à une question en français. If you would like subtitles in English for the French question, just click on the bottom right and you can get translated subtitles. La question est de Patrick André Madter, qui est à l'Université de Porto Rico. Étant donné les avantages cognitifs du bilinguisme précoce chez les enfants, ne peut-on pas être en faveur de l'éducation bilingue à l'école, y compris dans les écoles francophones, sans pour autant renoncer à imposer l'usage du français ou de toute autre langue minorisée dans les médias, les services publics, les conférences universitaires, aux côtés de l'anglais?
Alors, merci. Jusqu'à un certain point, la situation que vous décrivez, Monsieur Mater, est celle que je souhaiterais moi-même, que j'appelle de mes voeux, c'est-à-dire une sorte de bilinguisme. Monsieur Parizeau, à l'époque, avait une phrase qui semblait être pleine de bon sens, mais qui est quand même traversée de tension. Il disait, "Is it okay that I'm answering in French? Or should I answer in English?"
No, yeah, the question was asked in French, so you can answer.
Monsieur Parizeau avait une phrase dont on se souvient peut-être, ceux d'entre nous qui avons un âge suffisant, qui disait qu'il était en faveur du bilinguisme au niveau individuel et de l'unilinguisme institutionnel, qui semble être un compromis tout à fait raisonnable. Et c'est évidemment, ayant grandi au Québec à l'époque où cette vision était dominante, je dirais, et relativement consensuelle, je dirais, entre les communautés anglophones et francophones, c'est évidemment le compromis que j'appellerais de mes voeux. La question qu'il faut au moins que nous considérerions, c'est celle qui consiste à savoir si ce compromis est stable. Hein? Après tout, les institutions ne fonctionnent pas d'elles-mêmes. Les institutions sont faites d'individus et des motivations auxquelles les individus sont sujets. Et la question est de savoir si des individus qui seraient complètement bilingues dès la naissance et qui n'auraient donc de lien identitaire plus fort ni à l'une langue ni à l'autre, de plus grandes compétences dans une langue ni dans l'autre, ne seraient pas massivement sujets aux forces sociolinguistiques que j'ai décrites et donc sujet à faire de sorte que les institutions changent. J'en reviens au monde universitaire. Encore une fois, d'un point de vue individuel, j'ai énormément bénéficié du fait que le monde est énormément, dans les 30 ans que je pratique ce métier, que le monde universitaire se soit anglicisé, puisque ça augmente massivement le nombre de liens, de collaboration que je suis capable d'entreprendre à travers le monde. Mais ce qui est clair, c'est que les individus, que ce soit en Lettonie ou en Lituanie, dans les pays baltes où je vais souvent, en Suède, au Chili, ont pris la décision institutionnelle de réduire la mesure dans laquelle une institution quand même importante de leur société, donc la recherche universitaire, sera faite dans la langue du pays ou en anglais. Manière longue de répondre et je vais peut-être résumer de manière plus brève, le compromis, donc, bilinguisme individuel, unilinguisme institutionnel, peut être le compromis le plus attractif d'un certain point de vue, mais ne tient peut-être pas compte de la mesure dans laquelle, après tout, les institutions sont faites d'individus qui peuvent être amenés à en changer les règles de fonctionnement. Donc, c'est comme ça que je répondrai à votre question. J'espère que ça répond suffisamment à votre question.
Merci. On a beaucoup de questions. Fait que je vais continuer avec des questions. I'm going to ask questions from different people. A question from Melanie Carriage. I would like your take on the fact that the USA has no official language. Will this mean in areas where the majority speak another language, that this language will take over in terms of schooling, business interactions, etc.?
Right. So you're right, the United States doesn't have an official language, although in many states there has been so it doesn't have a federal national language, but many states have actually enacted English only legislation, especially obviously in places where Spanish is maybe not a majority, but where there's significant Spanish speakers. Now, the argument that I put forward is that in contexts like that, I would be a great advocate of bilingual education because, as it were, English is not really threatened by Spanish, either in the United States or on the global scale. The only argument I think that Anglophones in the United States would have to put forward in order to justify English-only education, for example, other than overtly racist ones, which I think we don't have to consider seriously at a sort of philosophical level, are the kinds of nation-building ones that I mentioned. And for reasons which I went over quite quickly, I don't think that they really pass muster. I think that there are all kinds of reasons in places where bilingual education would, and including for reasons that were mentioned by the French question a moment ago from the person whose name has disappeared from my screen, but there'd be all sorts of reasons to put bilingual schemes in places where, as it were, there is no linguistic threat to the kind of societal language. And I think that in the United States, it's very hard to make out a case for there being any threat to English anywhere, even in places where you have something close to a majority of Spanish speakers, just because of the immense pull that English has in virtue of its now global dominance.
We have a question from Lorraine O'Donnell. What kind of incentives could encourage English speakers to use more French outside of the school setting and so on in their daily lives?
Yeah. So I think that where the incentives really have to where one really has to consider the incentives is not so much with respect to the English community, but I would say perhaps with, so one of the things that let me take a step back. One of the things that I've noted in some of my writing some of the first writing that I did on language legislation in Quebec, is it creates a certain paradox, and it's a paradox which I think has to be part of the total picture that we paint. I'm operating on the assumption in this talk that it is a good thing, a desirable thing, all things considered, to engage in quite vigorous policy to promote the survival of languages. There's an alternate view, which is, and I think somebody in the question sort of raises it, to say, you know what, languages come and go. And if you look at the history of the world, the globally dominant languages like Latin have become extinct or only spoken by academics. And some people will say that this will be the fate of English eventually, and so we should just have a much more laissez-faire attitude towards language. I'm operating for the purposes of this argument on the reverse assumption, the assumption that it's a good thing to preserve linguistic diversity in the world, regionally, etc. So here's the paradox. The paradox is that the people who benefit least at the individual level from the linguistic policies that we put in place like Quebec are actually the members of the majority. Think about your typical sort of paradigmatic immigrant kid who goes to French school by law. They will come out of the system, as we can observe just by taking the 80 or the 55 bus in Montreal, usually fluently trilingual. They will have French because they've been educated in it. For a generation or two, they'll still speak the language of their parents, their patrimonial language, and they will also acquire English through all kinds of means. There's a famous sociolinguist whose name I forget, who said of English that you don't learn English, you catch it, right? It's so omnipresent that if you make yourself available to it, you will eventually develop some proficiency in it just by turning on the radio or watching movies or television or what have you. So in Quebec, given the language legislation, we've created generations of immigrant kids who are massively linguistically privileged in having 3 languages that were for free coming out of the school system. The people who are linguistically handicapped to the greatest degree are Francophone kids who usually don't have a third language, a patrimonial language that they will learn, who of course will have mastery in French, but whose English will be somewhat delayed and therefore not fluent because of the way in which French is introduced in the Quebec school system. Now, this is a way of saying that what is good for the language as a whole may not be good for individual kids, and in particular kids from the majority. I'm coming around to Lauren's question. I think one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, in spite of what I've just said, is it the case that the language is exercising such a degree of pressure in areas like education, in areas like entertainment, in areas like business, that Francophones themselves, the language will survive to the degree that the majority of Francophone Quebecers decide that it will survive, because the numbers are sufficient, really, for that to be the case. But the question is, and I have no answer to this, is given the pressure that is exercised on people to speak English in international business and commercial and academic pursuits, will the incentives be sufficient for immigrants, given their very vast linguistic repertoire, and even for Francophones to continue speaking French in contexts in which they actually are acquiring the competency to speak English? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think that that's where some of the action should really be focused. The measuring should be focused.
I have a question of my own. How bilingual is Quebec's education system really? I mean, we have compared to what we have in the Netherlands, for instance, where people come out of high school and they're fluently bilingual in French and English.
Yeah.
People come out of the French system, they speak English, but they're not as fluent as someone coming out of the Dutch system would be. And if you're going to the English system, if you're not going through the immersion, and even if, you know, some people who do go through immersion don't necessarily come out with the same level of fluency in French. So, you know,
it is so yeah, so it not at all. I think you're absolutely right. And to the extent that my talk is not about are we too bilingual now, but rather should we become more bilingual? In a city like Montreal, where English and French communities live side by side, it would seem like the empirical conditions for fully bilingual schools might be present. The idea, you know, when you talk to people coming from outside the province, the idea that we still have linguistic, you know, well, school boards, well, that we had linguistic school boards seems like an anomaly for Montreal. Why not just give kids the benefit of fully? So I think that right now we don't. You're absolutely right. We don't have fully bilingual schools. I think we have schools that reflect, maybe tacitly, the awareness on the part of people that it might shift the balance of incentives, shift the balance of sort of sociolinguistic forces, were we to move further in the direction of fully bilingual schools. But I think you're absolutely right. To the extent that I gave the impression that what I was arguing for, or what I was inviting us to sort of at least think about, is making schools less bilingual than they are now, that's not the case. The question I'm asking myself is, should we consider something that might, from some points of view, seem quite attractive in a context like Montreal, which is to make them more bilingual. I think there are great attractions to that idea, and maybe all things considered, if we were to take into account all of the sort of considerations that should be put in place, maybe the answer is we should. But I just wanted to make the limited point in this talk of pointing to the degree to which increasing the degree of bilingualism might have a sort of destabilizing impact on this very fragile sort of balance of sociolinguistic forces that we find ourselves in Quebec and in other places in the world that I've traveled to and talked to people about these issues in as well.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions, and there are a lot of responses to the questions. So
I'll try to be briefer.
Huh?
I'll try to be brief.
I mean, I'm going to skip some of the questions because
I see. Okay,
I'll let you as many different people.
Sure.
So you know, please read the comments and the Q&A if you're interested in some of the debates going on within the Q&A. But here's another question. Is an individual speaking English in Quebec privately and publicly an indicator that French is in decline or threatened in any way through your lens? And in the literature on the subject, is there any tendency to posit these two languages to be fundamentally competing? So the issue of, you know, the zero-sum game, you know, is there a competition between French and English? I'm guessing.
I'm going to answer the second question first, and then I'll ask you maybe to repeat. I see it right here. Okay, no need to repeat. So it is an assumption of, so there's a very famous, in a way, some people would say the father of modern sociolinguistic, who actually worked at the University of Ottawa for a long time, Jean Laponce, who has this this wonderful phrase, which I'm not going to get exactly right. It's much better on the page than what I will recount, which is that the more people from different language groups love one another, the more their languages hate one another. So let me parse that. Let me parse that a little bit. It was very easy to protect French in Quebec when French and English had very little interaction. The period of la survivance, you know, if we accept sort of some of the potted history, which I recognize is potted history, but let's go with it for the purposes of this, you know, where the French sort of were not, you know, lived within sort of slightly insular communities dominated by the church, didn't have much in the way of business interactions with the English. Very easy to protect French because there's no interaction. As people start interacting to a greater degree in business, start forming families, right? A very, very powerful source of the linguistic future of societies. As therefore people start loving one another to a greater degree, as it were, the languages, the sociolinguistic forces that make languages compete with one another kick in and make it the case that languages become threats to one another. Look, languages are in competition with one another, just as a matter of fact. Anybody who is on this call, on this meeting, who I'm assuming has lived at least part of their lives in Quebec, will have been repeatedly in their lives in small scale or medium scale settings, subject to or witnesses or participants in a situation where a group is trying to establish what language they will speak in order to maximize communication. And at that point, whether we like it or not, the individuals are not in communication, they're in collaboration, trying to arrive at the language that will allow them to communicate the best, to coordinate the best, but the languages are in competition. And so it is, I think, the paradox under which we live, which is that the desirable thing of greater interaction amongst cultural groups, amongst linguistic groups, gives rise to greater competition amongst the languages that they speak. Unless one finds oneself, as is the case perhaps in Belgium, in a situation where the languages are in almost perfect equipoise, where there isn't a strategic advantage that one language has with respect to another, just as a matter of socio-linguistic or demographic fact. And those cases are the exception rather than the rule, I would say. Let me go back to the first question in the where was it? I've lost the first part of the question. It's not on the screen anymore. Do you remember what the first part of the question was?
Yeah, I've lost it as well, but I think it was about if is the mere fact of someone speaking English on the street a threat to French, I guess, was the.
Well, I mean, the language of threat is one that we engage in. So I think the question had to do with the role of Anglophones. Yeah. So, you know, again, I think if one looks at number, I think that the big sort of determinant of the stability of the language will have to do not with the behavior of Anglophones in Quebec, but with the behavior of Francophones and people and immigrants. And that's where I think a lot of the concern lies. Is it the case that, of course, you know, I mean, all of the things that I said about language with respect to other people applies to Anglophones as well. They have an identity stake in their language continuing to thrive in the contexts in which they live, and that's perfectly legitimate and valid. And it'll lead Anglophones, people who, you know, don't just speak the language, but identify with it culturally, right? To want to use it in a greater number of contexts. And I think that that's something we just have to take as a given, just a parameter of the situation that we find ourselves living in Quebec. So I think the issue, and so I would be tempted to answer the question with a no. It's not it shouldn't be perceived as a threat, but just as a kind of a fact about what the coexistence of these two communities involves. Again, I think that the issue that we have to look at is the incentive structure in which Francophones themselves and people who acquire this kind of immigrants who acquire this more complex linguistic repertoire find themselves in. I mean, you know, another ways in which to think about immigrants who acquire a repertoire made up of several languages is they might not have as much of an identity stake in any of the languages that they speak. They might view language more instrumentally than, say, either historical Anglophones or historical Francophones in Quebec, and that introduces a new dynamic into as immigrants, you know, sort of grow in number, which is, again, I think in and of itself a desirable thing. It introduces a new dimension into the sort of complex dynamics that will determine whether the policies that we enacted 50 years ago are stable or give rise to a stable situation. And again, I don't know whether the answer to that question is yes or no, but I do think that it warrants sort of empirical attention.
Thank you very much. It's 12:59, and apologies if I didn't get to your question.
I'd be happy to. I mean, I should say, if I could just take 30 seconds,
yep.
First of all, to thank everybody for their attention, for their questions. I'm easy to find. You know, these are questions that fascinate me, that I've worked on a lot, that I have no sort of conclusion. I haven't reached any conclusions about them. I think they're genuinely difficult. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me offline by email, I'm pretty easy to find at McGill, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation with anyone who didn't get a chance to ask their question after today's session.
Okay, thank you for that offer, and thank you all for attending today's event. We always want to hear your feedback, and we invite you to fill out the evaluation form for today's Lunch and Learn, which my colleague will put in the chat. So please click on that link. Just a reminder, we have 2 Lunch and Learns coming up in February, one on the English language drama in Quebec, which will be focusing a lot on musicals before and after 1976 and the change that happened in the 70s. And another in French, looking at des initiatives visant à rapprocher les élèves anglophones et francophones du collégial au Québec. So looking at intercultural twinning initiatives at the cégep level. We also have an in-person workshop on blended learning on February 6th at Concordia University in collaboration with John Abbott College. The best way to learn about what's coming up in our programming is to sign up for our newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click on the link that will be added in the chat or follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn. In closing, I would again like to acknowledge that this event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. Questgren also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. I'd like to thank my colleague Anna Hunt for organizing this event and her technical assistance today. And thank you again to Dr. Daniel Weinstock and for all of you attending and your interest in this presentation. We wish you all a great day. See you next time.